My name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I approach an inquiry-based lesson? As a quick caveat, know that there are multiple ways of approaching inquiry. This is just one among many, but it's a place to start and begin. So as we go through here, please note that clearly you are in charge of your own classroom and that this is really meant to be a starting place instead of an ending place. It is different than how most classrooms are set up, and that will start to look differently from a kindergarten all the way up to a senior level course. As we've talked about before, much of what we're trying to do in a lesson really matters not in the lesson itself, but how it fits into a much larger scaffold. That ultimately, in a unit, supporting questions help drive students to be able to answer the compelling question in the form of an argument. We've talked about before about how for each of our units in our framework, there are standards that are bundled specifically around compelling questions. It is our hope that eventually, when you see an underlined supporting question in our framework, that you can click on that and it will take you to a page that begins with what you see here. This already exists in some degree in our curriculum, but it's going to take some time to build out the entire model. Once you land on the page, and we've got a few examples here from elementary, middle, and high, you can sort of see what we're thinking about when it comes to designing that curriculum for specifically a single lesson. So what you're seeing here are 5 standards, which means then that there are 5 standards that we're actually going to be teaching each day in social studies. That we begin each day with a supporting question. We have 2 disciplinary standards here, using evidence standard and communicating inclusion standard. I want to spend a little bit more time on this one than I will on the middle or high, just to give you an example of how these are balanced. We have at the top of our curriculum, what do you need to gain independence? This is a 5th grade example. And the 4th supporting question is, what ideas motivated the colonists towards independence? You can see that we've already got a supporting question and that we can do things instructionally that allow students to ask more questions about what's going on with these ideas. When it comes to the history standard, you can see how the foundational documents that developed the United States will be placed and be used as evidence to help students develop claims. In this particular lesson, we have sources from the Boston Massacre to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and as always, the Declaration of Independence. And that, the civic standard, really embodies those democratic principles of equality before the law, inalienable rights, consent to the governed, and right to alter or abolish government, which our documents actually embody. So we actually not only have standards that are aligning to the lesson, but we even have our sources aligned to the standards. And then ultimately communicating conclusions is about providing correct sequence, examples, and details, and so on. Here's an example of a middle school from a unit. This is actually the very first unit for our curricular framework for 6th grade. How does our environment shape us? Framed by the 10th supporting question, what do origin stories reveal about civilizations? Again, we're looking at aligning these to the disciplinary standards, a civic and geography standard. And what you'll notice here is that the geography standard actually helps sharpen the civic standard. You'll notice here this very big and broad civic standard. Analyze how historical, economic, and geographic characteristics influence social and government structures. Imagine then pulling out that element of geographic and actually inserting the geography standard where that is stating. So that essentially we're creating a new standard by the combination of these two. So imagine reading it as, analyze how physical environments shape the development of civilizations, right? Social and government structures at the same time, right? So you're sort of intertwining these together. Our high school example here, as you can see, that was co-created by Leslie Moyer and C.C. Funk, is looking at, in our world history, how do ideas lead to oppression? And we're looking specifically here at imperialism. This is actually the very first supporting question. What role did ideas and religion play in imperialism? Again, we're looking at how cultural and economic decisions influence characteristics of various places, which is paramount when you're looking at the culture of places both invading and being invaded, and the economic incentives that exist on that action. And ultimately, we're looking at the intended and unintended consequences of public policies, both nationally and internationally, as groups decide to do this. So let's take a look at, as we've reviewed before, what a lesson might look like in a typical class. So imagine then at the beginning of class, starting off immediately with engaging the question. I oftentimes did not use flashbacks because much of what I was doing was already layered and needed so that students on the first day are going to need that information for the second and third and so on. So that there's a continuous building as you're building students throughout that scaffold. When it comes to engaging the question, we're using the supporting question as a learning target as it is framing the learning for that day and also being contextualized and built towards with a compelling question at the end of the unit. Engaging the question through sources and discussion is a good way of getting students motivated early on to really diving in what the question is asking and what it is they're going to be answering by the end of the class. Engaging sources through discussion is oftentimes the most difficult part and one that we'll talk about today, because you're really going to have to become a reading and writing teacher, helping students figure out how to read complex sources while also allowing them to collaborate through discussion tasks to complete organizational tasks to better get at what students are thinking. Organizational tasks and discussion tasks help make visible what is going on in students' minds when they're trying to figure out sources. It's part of that productive struggle that we can also, again, help them scaffold that will make this a much more engaging experience. And ultimately, by the end of the lesson, students will be communicating conclusions by the creating verbal or written or some type of multimodal argument tasks. And that can also be reflected upon and challenged through discussion tasks. This looks like a lot, and it is. And it's going to be linked into the documents here, but we're going to break this down. So essentially, if you can imagine this chart laid over into the specifics of this one. At the very top, you'll notice it talks about structuring a lesson. We see engaging supporting questions at the very top with a suggestion of time. Of course, everyone's time is a little bit different. We've got 45-minute classes, we have 90-minute classes across the district. So you'll have to really look at this. Now, a lesson is really defined as a beginning and end of a supporting question. If you're teaching in a place that has 90 minutes, you might actually be able to get 2 supporting questions in during that 90-minute period. When I was teaching in the high school, we had 60-minute classes. There were times that even with that, I was able to get 2 in. I would say that 25 minutes is about as little time as you can provide, and that's really going to shortchange some of the sources. So here we have at the very top, engaging the supporting question, engaging sources through discussion, and then ultimately communicating conclusions. So let's break this down. How might you begin a lesson? Again, we've talked about multiple ways of doing this. You can obviously pause at any time to do this or follow up about what these might look like as we're going to be able to try to provide some examples of these. When it comes to engaging supporting questions, please note that we could question the question, we could spark curiosity with the source, we can contextualize within the compelling question, or we could even give a background mini lecture, so long as that mini lecture doesn't trump the question and provide answers for the students on that. Just more of helping them better understanding the context or maybe the background that's necessary. When it comes to the discussion cycle, there are multiple ways that you can do this. By discussion cycle, we mean that middle part of having students engage together in the sources to try to come to some conclusions collaboratively to be able to answer these much larger questions. What are the elements of a discussion cycle? So individuals, right, are who our students are and want to be, they will begin looking at a source independently, as just one example. Then, as a group, they'll work on organizational tasks, which again, a reminder are anything from Venn diagrams to T-charts to webbings to completing organizers of some sort. They'll have discussion about this, working together on these organizers, right, as they're digging into the source. The teacher during this time is walking around, helping students individually or even in small group listening to the conversation so that when they're able to return to the full class, teachers are able to facilitate a lot of the learning that students are doing around those organizational tasks and the types of questions you include in those, the discussions and prompts that you give them, or even diving deeper into the sources. I've given here a breakdown of how long it might take. This is just one example of what I did in my class after several iterations of the cycle as my students and myself got more used to the routine. Obviously, please change this, and it will take some time to develop your own rhythm in the classroom. How to use discussion cycles to engage questions, sources, and tasks. So we've been talking about this, and this is really about how you would structure with multiple sources. Now, this might be too many sources that you're looking at. Again, this is just one example where you could literally have doing it source by source. If you look at the third one, we actually have two sources. Perhaps you provide two there. And then students could be looking at two sources individually, then as a group, and then as a full class. I've done this both ways, and both ways seem to work so long as the sources make sense. When it comes to corroborating evidence, for example, sometimes pairing two sources together this way helps students see the commonalities and disagreements between sources. Ultimately, after the dotted line, it becomes a reverse group of this, right? Where as you're trying to gradually release the students to be able to answer the formative performance task, you might have them look at a group. How would you answer this formative performance task? How would you write this claim? What evidence would you use? The teacher then can come back and facilitate a full class conversation if the teacher feels that scaffold is necessary. Maybe not. Maybe after the group stuff, they can go right into writing those claims or speaking those claims at the end of the course. How do you end a lesson? Sometimes you don't have enough time to be able to write. Sometimes we don't have enough time in the day to be able to assess the writing that students do. Typically, in a given week, I would have my students write 2 to 3 times. And it could just be some very short writing. It could just be an explanation or maybe a description of something. If you don't have enough time to do that when it comes to a written way, a verbal way is just fine. And here's a few different examples that you could use to help motivate your students at the end of the class. The goal with communicated conclusion is that students are synthesizing what they've learned from the sources in their own understanding. So that you can imagine a turn and talk where students might be given an option to say, choose one of the sources that you looked at today, turn to a neighbor, and explain how that source helps answer the supporting question. It could be as simple as that. So let's take a deeper dive into what a lesson might look like. So here we have a situation of the middle school example we saw earlier, looking at what do origin stories reveal about civilizations. At the very bottom of that landing page, we have this lesson divided up by the question, task, and sources. So here we have the larger compelling question, so that we're always framed and oriented towards it. We have a supporting question, we've already mentioned. And here we have engaging that question by contextualizing it. This is one of my favorite ways of getting students involved at the very beginning of class, getting them to ask questions. Discuss other questions you might need to ask in order to answer the supporting question. You could imagine here that students might say things like, what does reveal mean? Or what is a civilization? Or what do you mean by origin stories? And who gets to tell them? And what are they about? And is this about Batman and Superman? And if they make those kind of connections, then fantastic. Their lived experiences is helping inform our understanding of how human beings have been telling stories to each other since the beginning of time. Under task, we have two different types here. We have an organizational task about listing and comparing how the environment was used, and we're going to be inferring to explain the origin of civilizations. And ultimately, the formative performance task, students are going to be creating a claim back with the evidence that answers the supporting question. Here we have a series of different sources, and as you can see from these sources, we're pulling from around the world. It has origin stories, it has civilizations, both plural. If we just look at one area, then it's going to be sort of sending the wrong signal to students that origin stories only look one way at one part of the world. Here we have Egyptian, Indian, Greek, and Hawaiian. Here's an example of what an organizational task might look like. We see that the sources are clearly delineated. We have students using disciplinary literacy questions about who, sort of sourcing each document. We talk about the content piece, what parts of the environment are discussed, so that this is adding into the language of the standards that we're hoping that students will be able to use and that we can then help them with. And then what kind of inference from the sources can we make about the people that created the origin story? This is where they're going to have to dive deeper into and do better close readings of what's going on. This is also going to be the most difficult part for students, which is why scaffolding them in a certain way, they may not get that on the first round by themselves. They may not be able to get that together as a group, but ultimately through the whole class, you'll be able to help them steer that way, but after they have tried to do it first. That's the important part. After this, they might share the similarities and differences between these four sources so that they can then answer a formative performance task about creating a claim backed with evidence that answers the supporting question. Here's just a few examples of what some of these sources might look like. We will always provide annotations and a link to the original. And so that you can see by the very end, we're returning in reverse order. We've looked at the sources. Do they help us create a list in our organizational task? Absolutely. Do they help us answer the compelling question or the supporting question? Absolutely. And then do these actually embody the standards? So we've got questions. We've got looking at primary and secondary sources, determining their relevance, intended use to help answer question. We're actually using and constructing claims as a way of doing so according to communicating conclusions. We're looking at the physical environments and how they shaped civilizations culturally, which is exactly what the standards are talking about. So again, this is how a typical class might look. The examples that I showed typically operated in my class about 50 to 60% of the time. Beginning the lesson, middle of the lesson, ending the lesson. Engaging the question, engaging the sources through discussion, communicating conclusion. We have questions, tasks, and sources throughout. So this session has been about how do I approach an inquiry-based lesson as one possible among many examples. Thank you.